His peace was interrupted when a boy no older than 6 years old approached him. He was holding a small paper bag, clutched tightly in his small fingers. His eyes shone with fear and determination. He approached and, with a tremor in his voice, whispered something in Keanu's ear. The actor instantly turned pale. His hands froze over his cup of coffee, and his heart began to beat faster. He immediately pulled out his phone and dialed 911. What he heard from the boy changed his life forever. Los Angeles shimmered under the golden hues of the setting sun as the city pulsed with energy. The streets were alive with the hurried footsteps of people heading home from work, couples strolling hand in hand, and the distant honking of cars merging onto busy intersections. Amidst this symphony of urban life, Keanu Reeves took an unusual detour. Instead of heading to a high-end restaurant or retreating to the solitude of his home, he pulled into a modest café along a bustling avenue. The simplicity of it felt grounding. He had spent the day involved in a charity event, interacting with children from underprivileged backgrounds, offering them a few moments of joy. Now, he craved a quiet moment to himself, away from the spotlight. The café was small, yet inviting. The warm scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sweetness of baked goods. Inside, the dim lighting gave the place a cozy atmosphere, a stark contrast to the glaring lights of Hollywood that usually surrounded him. He placed an order for a black coffee and a light meal, choosing a secluded table by the window where he could observe the world passing by without drawing attention to himself. As he sipped his coffee, he allowed his thoughts to drift. The chatter of patrons, the rhythmic clinking of silverware against ceramic plates, and the occasional burst of laughter blended into a comforting background noise. It was rare for him to have such a moment, one where he wasn't being recognized or approached. He cherished these simple pleasures, the kind that made him feel like just another person in a crowded city. However, something disrupted this tranquility. A faint presence at the edge of his vision caught his attention. A small boy, no older than 6, stood hesitantly a few feet away. His blond hair was messy, and his oversized blue t-shirt hung loosely over his frail frame. In his hands, he clutched a crumpled paper bag, his tiny fingers gripping it tightly as though it held something precious. The boy's eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Keanu. His expression wavered between uncertainty and determination. It was evident that he was working up the courage to do something, though what, Keanu couldn't quite tell. He continued sipping his coffee, giving the boy space to make his decision. After a moment of hesitation, the child took slow, cautious steps toward him. The cafe bustled with movement. Yet the boy seemed oblivious to his surroundings, his entire focus locked onto Keanu. As he approached, his grip on the paper bag tightened. He stopped just beside the table, standing still for a second before mustering the nerve to lean in slightly. Keanu noticed the slight tremor in his small hands. The child's lips parted, and he whispered something, his voice so faint that it was almost drowned by the background noise. The instant the words left the boy's mouth, Keanu's expression shifted. His hand, which had been casually resting on the table, went rigid. A cold sensation washed over him, his entire body responding to an immediate surge of adrenaline. He put his coffee down, his fingers tightening into a fist. He looked at the boy again, this time with a newfound intensity. His instincts, honed over years of experience both in and outside the film industry, told him that this was serious. This wasn't just a lost child looking for help. This was something much darker. A subtle shift in the atmosphere made Keanu hyper-aware of his surroundings. The cafe, once filled with the light chatter of people enjoying their evening, now seemed suffocating. He scanned the room with careful precision. That's when he saw him. At a far corner of the cafe, a man sat with a posture too stiff to be natural. He wore a dark, fitted suit, his hair slicked back meticulously. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were locked onto them. The tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed slowly against the wooden table, all signaled something was wrong. Keanu understood immediately. The child was afraid, and this man, whoever he was, had something to do with it. His mind raced, quickly evaluating the situation. If the child had come to him, bypassing every other adult in the cafe. That meant he believed Keanu could protect him. And Keanu wasn't about to let him down. Without hesitation, he slipped his phone from his pocket beneath the table, his fingers moving swiftly over the screen. He dialed 911, keeping the phone discreetly angled. He didn't need to say much, just enough for the operator to understand that something was terribly wrong. The boy shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder. The man in the suit noticed the movement and rose from his seat. His motions were controlled, deliberate, as if he was measuring every step before taking it. His gaze remained fixed on Keanu and the child, his lips pressing into a tight line. Keanu remained calm on the surface, but internally, every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to react if necessary. The man walked toward them, weaving through the tables with a slow, calculated pace. Other patrons remained unaware of the silent tension building between them. Keanu quickly analyzed his options. He had called for help, but it would take minutes for emergency responders to arrive. The child's fear was palpable, and the last thing Keanu wanted was to let the situation escalate before help got there. He needed to act, not rashly, but carefully. The man finally reached their table, stopping just a foot away. The faintest hint of a smirk played on his lips, but it never reached his eyes. He exuded an air of control, but there was an underlying menace beneath his polished appearance. Keanu subtly shifted his position, ensuring he was between the boy and the man. His movements were unassuming, but his message was clear. He wasn't going to let this stranger get to the child without a fight. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. The cafe's atmosphere carried on as usual, but for Keanu, the moment had frozen in time. He was prepared for whatever came next, knowing that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he had anticipated. The moment stretched as Keanu Reeves remained seated, his body language relaxed, but his mind working at a furious pace. The presence of the suited man loomed like a storm cloud, his sharp eyes flicking between the child and Keanu, as if assessing the situation before making a move. The child, still clutching the crumpled paper bag, shifted uneasily. His shoulders were hunched, his fingers digging into the fabric of his faded blue t-shirt. The weight of his fear was almost tangible, and Keanu could feel it pressing against him. He had spent enough time on movie sets studying tension and control, but this was no performance. This was real. The stranger's presence radiated a silent authority, the kind that came with years of knowing exactly how to manipulate and control a situation. Keanu watched as the man adjusted his tie, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle as he prepared to speak. But words were not necessary. His movements spoke volumes. He was confident, but there was something else beneath that surface, something darker. Keanu's mind calculated the possibilities. He had already made the emergency call, but he had no way of knowing how far away the authorities were, or if they would even treat the situation with the urgency it demanded. Time was slipping by, and he needed to act, but he couldn't afford to escalate things unnecessarily. The child's safety was the priority. The cafe around them continued in its normal rhythm. A waitress passed by, oblivious to the silent war of nerves unfolding in the back corner. A couple in the far booth laughed over their drinks, the clinking of cups and silverware creating a deceptive sense of normalcy. But Keanu knew better than to be lulled into a false sense of security. He had been in enough situations, albeit fictional ones, to understand the value of controlled action. The man in the suit remained still for a moment longer before he finally moved. His motion was smooth, deliberate, as he reached into his pocket. Keanu's body tensed, ready for whatever came next. But instead of a weapon, the man withdrew a business card and placed it gently on the table. The action was deliberate, calculated. Keanu barely spared a glance at the card. He knew whatever was printed there was likely a front, an alias or some fabricated identity meant to legitimize this stranger's presence. His eyes remained locked on the man's expression, searching for cracks in his composure. The child inhaled sharply, his small body flinching as the man tapped the card once with his index finger, as if reinforcing some unspoken command. Keanu could feel the pulse of fear rolling off the boy, his small fingers wrapping even tighter around the paper bag, as if the contents held the only source of comfort he had left in the world. The weight of the moment became unbearable. The man in the suit finally took a small step back, his lips curving slightly. There was no warmth in the smile, just a ghost of satisfaction, like a chess player anticipating his opponent's next move. Keanu wasn't sure what game he was playing, but he wasn't about to let the child become a pawn in it. A small, unexpected shift changed the dynamics of the situation. The door to the cafe swung open, and a uniformed police officer stepped inside. The sight of the law enforcer seemed to finally crack the man's composure. It was subtle, just the smallest flicker of irritation in his otherwise impassive features, but Keanu caught it. The officer was scanning the room, his radio crackling faintly at his hip. Keanu didn't need to signal him. The officer's gaze landed directly on them, and he began to approach. The man in the suit turned his attention back to Keanu, his expression momentarily unreadable. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, his confidence returned. Keanu knew that this man wasn't going to make a scene. He had a reputation to uphold, a carefully constructed image that wouldn't allow for outbursts or reckless behavior. Instead, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging some silent agreement between them. Then, with an eerie calmness, he turned and walked toward the exit. The child exhaled a shaky breath, his grip on the paper bag loosening just slightly. The weight of the moment still hung heavily in the air, but for the first time since their encounter began, there was a shift in power. The officer reached their table just as the man stepped outside, vanishing into the streets of Los Angeles like a shadow retreating with the setting sun. Keanu leaned back slightly, his muscles still tense, but his mind slowly processing the change in circumstances. The officer spoke, his voice breaking through the static in Keanu's head, but the actor barely registered the words. His attention was on the child, who was still visibly shaken, but no longer paralyzed with fear. Keanu glanced toward the cafe entrance, but the man was gone. The police were here now, but something in his gut told him that this wasn't over. The way the man had walked away, as if leaving of his own accord, made Keanu uneasy. He had the sense that he hadn't won just yet. This was merely the opening move in a much larger game. The child, now looking slightly more secure with the officer nearby, finally unclenched his fingers and carefully unwrapped the crumpled paper bag he had been holding so tightly. What lay inside would change everything. The air in the cafe still felt thick, carrying the weight of the tense encounter that had just unfolded. Keanu Reeves remained seated for a moment, his fingers loosely curled around the now-cool cup of coffee he had forgotten about entirely. The child beside him clutched the crumpled paper bag with both hands, as if afraid to loosen his grip even slightly. His small fingers trembled against the worn paper, a clear sign that whatever was inside held far more significance than mere scraps. The officer, a sturdy man with sharp but kind eyes, lowered himself slightly to meet the child's gaze. The badge on his uniform caught the dim light of the cafe, a stark contrast to the boy's pale face. The child's breathing was uneven, his tiny chest rising and falling with a rhythm that suggested the sheer effort it took for him to remain still. Keanu could feel it too, the tension, the fear that still clung to the air like the scent of burnt coffee lingering long after it had been spilled. Finally, the officer spoke in a calm, measured voice, his words meant to soothe rather than interrogate. The child's eyes flickered to him, then back to Keanu, as if seeking reassurance that he was still safe. Keanu nodded slightly, a silent confirmation that whatever happened next, he wouldn't leave him alone in this. Slowly, hesitantly, the boy uncurled his fingers from the bag. The paper crinkled as it unfolded, revealing its contents, something small, metallic, and slightly tarnished. Keanu's gaze narrowed as he took in the sight, a simple key, attached to a faded red keychain. The plastic covering the keychain was cracked, its once bright color now dull with age. It was an ordinary object, something most people wouldn't think twice about. But to this child, it was everything. The officer observed it carefully, recognizing that there was more to this than met the eye. Keanu could sense the shift, the silent acknowledgement that they had just uncovered something much bigger than a frightened boy in a cafe. The key wasn't just a key. It was a message, a plea, a piece of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The officer reached for his radio, muttering a few words into the device as he signaled for additional support. Meanwhile, Keanu turned his attention back to the child, who was still staring at the key in his hands. The boy's expression was difficult to read, his emotions a tangled mess of fear, hesitation, and something else, something close to relief. Keanu knew better than to rush him. Instead, he waited, allowing the boy to speak when he was ready. The child's fingers traced the edges of the keychain, his gaze distant as if lost in a memory. The cafe around them continued as usual. Customers chatting, baristas calling out orders, the hum of the espresso machine creating a steady backdrop to their unfolding moment. But for Keanu and the boy, everything else had faded away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the child lifted his gaze to Keanu's, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever he said was enough to make Keanu's chest tighten, his protective instincts flaring stronger than ever. This wasn't just about a lost key. This was about something far more dangerous, something that had forced this child to take a risk and reach out to a stranger for help. The officer, now more focused than before, radioed in the information, his face serious as he processed what little they had uncovered so far. Keanu knew they needed to move quickly. Whatever this key unlocked, whatever it represented, was important. And the person who had been watching them, the suited man who had left moments ago, wasn't done with them yet. Keanu turned his head slightly, his instincts alerting him to something outside the cafe's large window. A car was parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing whoever sat inside. The engine was still running. Someone was waiting. A chill ran down his spine. They weren't safe yet. The hum of the cafe faded into the background as Keanu Reeves kept his gaze locked on the car parked outside. The vehicle was positioned strategically across the street, engine running, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Something about it sent a chill through his spine. He had spent enough time on film sets, reading people and understanding tension, to know when he was being watched. The child beside him still clutched the key tightly, his small fingers pressing into the faded plastic of the keychain. The officer, now more alert than before, had noticed the shift in atmosphere. The radio at his hip crackled as he received a response from dispatch, confirming that additional units were en route. But Keanu knew time was slipping away. If someone was watching, they wouldn't wait much longer. The boy shifted in his seat, his shoulders tense, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He had done something brave by approaching Keanu, but now the fear was catching up to him. The weight of whatever secret he carried was becoming unbearable. Keanu understood that feeling. The moment when you realize there's no turning back, that you've crossed a threshold where only forward movement can save you. Outside, the car's brake lights flickered for a second. A door opened, and a figure stepped out. The same suited man from before. His posture was controlled, his movements precise, as if every step was calculated. He adjusted his jacket with slow deliberation, scanning the street before turning his gaze toward the cafe. Even through the glass, his eyes found Keanu's, locking onto him like a predator recognizing a threat. Keanu's heartbeat remained steady, but he felt the subtle shift in his body, the quiet tension of readiness. The officer beside him straightened as well, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster, though he didn't draw his weapon yet. The boy shrank slightly into Keanu's side, his grip on the key tightening even further. The man didn't rush. He walked toward the cafe entrance, weaving between pedestrians who were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed they were still in control. Keanu recognized the type. Men who operated in shadows, who had built their lives around never being questioned. But this time, he had made a mistake. The doorbell jingled softly as the suited man stepped inside. His gaze swept the room before settling on Keanu and the boy. His lips curved into a tight, polite smile, but his eyes remained devoid of warmth. He took a slow step forward, but the officer beside Keanu stood as well, positioning himself between the man and the boy. For a moment, everything stood still. The cafe patrons, caught in their own conversations and meals, remained unaware of the tension crackling through the air. But Keanu knew they were moments away from something breaking. He kept his posture relaxed, but his mind raced through the possible outcomes. If the man was here, that meant he wasn't alone. There was likely another car, another set of eyes watching. The moment police backup arrived, the dynamic would shift, but until then, it was a dangerous balance. The suited man finally spoke, his voice smooth, controlled. Keanu didn't need to hear the words to understand the intent behind them. He was trying to reclaim control of the situation, to convince everyone in the room that nothing was out of place. But Keanu had already seen through the act. The officer didn't waver. He responded with equal composure, though his stance remained firm. His radio crackled again, a signal that help was closing in. The suited man's eyes flickered toward the sound, the first sign of irritation breaking through his mask of calm. Keanu exhaled slowly. He knew the man wasn't going to push things further here. Not with the police presence. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, another car pulled up, this time marked with flashing lights. The suited man's jaw tensed, but he didn't resist. He simply nodded once, stepping back toward the door, as if conceding this round of the game. He exited as smoothly as he had entered, disappearing back into the street, just as two uniformed officers stepped inside. The tension remained thick, even as the police moved in, questioning the officer beside Keanu and assessing the situation. The boy hadn't moved, his grip still firm around the key, as if afraid that letting go would mean losing everything. Keanu turned to him, offering a steady presence in the chaos. They weren't finished yet, not until they found out what the key unlocked, not until they knew the truth. The flashing lights outside the cafe cast flickering shadows against the walls, illuminating the tension that still hung thick in the air. The officers who had just arrived assessed the situation quickly, exchanging quiet words with their colleague who had been present from the beginning. Keanu Reeves remained still, his posture relaxed, but his mind racing. The boy beside him had barely moved, his small hands still tightly wrapped around the key. His knuckles had turned white from the pressure, and his breathing remained shallow, uneven. Outside, the suited man had vanished into the night, slipping into the anonymity of the city. But Keanu knew this wasn't over. This wasn't the kind of situation that resolved itself in a single encounter. The child's fear, the presence of that man, and the significance of the key all pointed towards something much larger. The only question was how deep the rabbit hole went. One of the officers finally turned toward Keanu, his expression serious yet calm. His badge reflected the dim light of the cafe as he spoke, his voice low enough that no one outside their small group could hear. The boy flinched slightly at the sound, but remained silent. Keanu watched the officer's face carefully, trying to gauge what was being said. There was something in his tone that suggested urgency, a recognition that whatever had been set in motion tonight needed immediate action. Keanu nodded, understanding without needing to be told explicitly. He turned his attention back to the child, still holding onto the key, as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The plastic casing was cracked, the metal worn from years of use. It was an ordinary object, but it had led them to an extraordinary moment. The officer gestured toward the door, indicating that they needed to move. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder before standing, making sure the child stayed close to his side. As they stepped outside, the night air was crisp, the scent of rain lingering faintly in the distance. The street had quieted somewhat, but the presence of police vehicles made it clear that something significant had transpired. A car had been prepared for them, its back door open, waiting. The officer motioned for them to get inside. Keanu hesitated for a brief moment, glancing toward the surrounding buildings, half expecting to see the suited man watching from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the hum of the city continuing on, unaware of the story unfolding within it. The child slid into the back seat, still clutching the key. Keanu followed, his instincts on high alert. The door closed, sealing them inside the temporary sanctuary of the police vehicle. The officer in the front seat turned slightly, glancing at them in the rearview mirror before starting the engine. The drive was silent at first. The boy remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the key in his hands. Keanu watched him, recognizing the weight of whatever thoughts were running through his young mind. Finally, after several minutes, The boy shifted slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever he said made the officer's grip tighten on the steering wheel, his gaze hardening as he processed the words. Keanu absorbed the revelation with quiet intensity. He hadn't known what to expect when the boy had first approached him back at the cafe, but now he understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a lost child. This wasn't about a simple rescue. This was about something much bigger, something dangerous, something that had been hidden in plain sight. The key wasn't just a key. It was a link to something that someone didn't want them to find. As the car moved through the city, Keanu could feel the momentum shifting. They were no longer just reacting to a threat. They were actively moving toward uncovering the truth. The child had taken a risk in reaching out, and now it was up to them to make sure that risk wasn't in vain. The officer spoke briefly into his radio, relaying the information they had just learned. The response came quickly, a confirmation that reinforcements were being sent to an undisclosed location. Keanu didn't need to ask where they were going. He could sense that they were heading straight into the heart of whatever had begun that night. The streets blurred past in streaks of neon and headlights, the pulse of the city unyielding. But inside the car, time felt suspended, the anticipation building with every mile. The child shifted again, finally looking up from the key, his eyes meeting Keanu's for the first time in what felt like forever. There was fear there, yes, but also something else, trust. Keanu gave a small nod, silent but firm. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And this time, they wouldn't be alone.